Welcome to Gold, Goats, and Justice, a series where we're digging into some of the stories of Jesus. Stories are powerful. They capture our imagination, they change our perspective, they can even shape our hearts. And Jesus was a master storyteller. My name is James, and in this series, we'll be looking at 7 different stories that Jesus told. And our hope for this series is that through examining these stories with your group, they will begin to sink down into your heart and shape your life. We want these stories to speak for themselves, so before you watch this short teaching video, we want to make sure that you take some time with your group to read and discuss the passage. So if you haven't already done that today, go ahead and pause this video so that you can spend some time reading and discussing for yourselves. Now, one of the things that can be helpful when reading the stories of Jesus is to try and see if there are some specific reasons that Jesus is telling that particular story. Because many of Jesus' stories were either spoken in response to a situation or are spoken as an illustration to a larger theme that he's teaching about. That means that doing a quick skim through of the paragraphs before and after the story can be immensely helpful in understanding his point. Now, today's passage is a good illustration of this happening because before Luke retells Jesus' story, he actually shows us the situation that prompted Jesus to tell it. In Luke chapter 18, verse 9, he wrote, "He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt." Now, it's apparent here that some people who were listening to Jesus tended to compare themselves to others as a way of bolstering how they felt about their relationship to God. And let's be honest, that's a really easy thing to do. It's easy to look at our neighbors or our coworkers and say, man, at least I am not that bad. I mean, I do go to church, I do serve once a month with the hospitality team, I do tithe, and you know what? They're drunk every weekend. They sleep with anything that has a pulse. I don't do any of that. And it becomes easy for us to feel more secure in our relationship with God because we feel like there are other people who are so much worse than we are. Jesus is speaking directly to this attitude of looking down on others to help bolster your sense of righteousness. And he tells this story. This is verse 10. He says, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, "God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get." But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humble, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Today, I want to point to 2 aspects of this story. First, notice that the Pharisee confused his outward acts of obedience as being the thing that made him right before God. This guy, he's a Pharisee, so he's presumably some sort of spiritual leader, and when he prays, he does 2 things. He compares himself to people who are more sinful than he is as a way of showing how morally upright he thinks he is. He says, "I thank you that I'm not like all these other sinners in the world." And then he proclaims his immense efforts at devotion and obedience. He doesn't just fast when it's required. No, he fasts twice a week. And he is generous, tithing from all that he gets. This Pharisee is trusting that his lifestyle has put him in the all good category with God. But at the end of the story, Jesus makes it clear that this is not the man that's justified before God. Instead, the man who is justified is the one whose lifestyle was anything but obedient. Tax collectors, they were thought of as being like the low-life extortioners in society. But this guy, this tax collector, stands there, beats his breast, and he says, in shame, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Now, a helpful way to think about this is to imagine that both of these men die and stand before God, and God asks them, "Why should you be allowed into my eternal kingdom?" Well, the first one, the Pharisee, he says, "Hey, I've been moral my entire life. I've never committed adultery or practiced extortion. Just look at my life compared to all the tax collectors and adulterers and sinners. I've never done any of those bad things. And I've gone above and beyond in my attempts to being obedient. I fasted twice a week. I tithed on all my income, my before tax income, not just my after tax income." Then imagine that same conversation between God and the tax collector. God says, "Tax collector, tell me why you should be allowed into my eternal kingdom." And the tax collector responds by saying, "Hey, I know what my life has been. I recognize my sin. My only hope is to trust in you that you'll have mercy on me." Jesus says that it's the tax collector's attitude that justified him, not the Pharisees. Now, it's not that Jesus thinks that living a moral life and obedience are bad things. Actually, we're going to read some stories in this series that show that Jesus really cares about our obedience. But the thing that makes us right before God is not good works of obedience. Instead, it's recognizing that we are sinners, even the most obedient of us, and that our only hope is that God offers us mercy through Jesus. Faith that through Jesus, God will save us, makes us right with Him. Now, there's a second thrust in this story as well, which is that Jesus is forcing us to see the incongruence of bragging on our external obedience while maintaining an attitude of contempt towards others. This is one of the themes in Jesus' teachings all over the New Testament. True faith doesn't just create external obedience, it also changes how we think about other people. Just think of all of the ways that Jesus taught about having an attitude of love toward others. He said things like, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you, love your neighbor as yourself, whatever you wish others would do to you, do also to them. Jesus' teachings are full of comments about how love for God that does not produce a love for others shows that we don't truly understand God's intention for our lives. This story hits that point home. It doesn't matter how righteous your life looks. If your view of others is governed by contempt, you're missing the point. This story challenges how we think about our relationship towards God and towards other people. And I hope that the discussion time in your group helps you think through how this should change the way you live on an everyday basis. Well, I hope you enjoyed this teaching video, and we'll see you again next week for our next story from Jesus.